country looks out for me.
What do we want? What do we want it? What do we want? What do we want it?
We're learning from this. This activism is where we're learning. And yeah, it should be dealt with outside of school, but it's not being dealt with outside of school. And that's why we're
Today, Resources Minister Matt Canavan suggested they go to school to learn how to build more mines.
Walking off school and protesting, you don't learn anything from that. You know, the best thing you learn about going for a protest is how to join the goal queue.
Hello, my name is Jan Wisniewski, and this is The Strife, a podcast thinking about issues in Australia with the long term in mind. Recently, upwards of 15,000 Australian school students went on strike in protest of the government's climate policies. That's a pretty good effort. This was followed by a lot of media chatter about whether it's okay for kids to wag school and swear at politicians. Meanwhile, the latest report summarising scientific findings related to the climate suggests we have to cut greenhouse gas emissions by about 45% by 2030 to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. These scientists don't reckon we're going to get there, so those protesting students will have to bear the brunt of what that warming will bring. Over in Poland, delegates from across the globe have gathered to talk about the next steps in international climate action, but they've got stuck talking about coal. Sick. Nick Everett wrote an article for Red Flag on how the student strike offers a way forward for climate action. In my conversation with him, he suggests it's time we rally around these kids and reassess what our economic system is doing to our planet and the people who live here. Thanks for listening. So last week we had images of Australia's student strike for climate action hit the news, and we saw plenty of snappy signs and some impressive speeches from the students aimed squarely at our politicians in Canberra. Mm-hmm. Did these protests fill you with some hope that we might be able to turn the tide on climate change action?
Well, I think that remains to be seen, but I think the protest was most definitely inspiring and is in fact the largest high school student walkout in Australia since the Iraq War, which is some 15 years ago now. So that certainly encourages me, and I think it is also reflective of international attention on the issue and action by young people in other countries as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I must admit that the protest kind of snuck up on me, and I haven't really got much of an understanding of how it was organised. So do you have a bit of background on how the strike was organised and what sparked the action?
So two students from Castlemaine in rural Victoria initiated the action, and they did so in response to hearing of Greta Thunberg's protest in Sweden. Uh-huh. And they spread the word. They were supported by a number of environment organisations in Australia, and the protest gathered initially some media attention in The Guardian, and a few days out from the protest, some international media and more mainstream media in Australia as well.
Mm-hmm. And even during the week that the protest took place and shortly after, we saw, I guess it'd be fair to say, a negative reaction from our government. What does that suggest to you?
Yes, so Scott Morrison, our Prime Minister, 3 days out from the action, made a statement in Parliament saying that schools shouldn't be parliaments and that there should be less activism in schools. Mm-hmm. And I think many young people and students across high schools took that as a green light, that in fact they needed to do more. So his words were actually helpful insofar as they brought more mainstream media attention on the issue, and they were decidedly condemned by students who came out in, I think, greater numbers in response to Scott Morrison's statement. It wasn't the only statement by a politician condemning the protest, and I would say that from Australia's mainstream parties there was ambivalence at best. There are some environment organisations with a focus on lobbying those same politicians, but I think we've seen a track record in Australia of both major parties basically asleep at the wheel in action on climate change and that's really what's spurred students to take strike action.
Yeah. So you wrote a piece about the strike action, and you took some time in that piece to critique the idea that individual actions alone can save our planet.
Yeah.
Which you suggested is the underlying message of the ABC show War on Waste, which I do think does a pretty good job getting people to think about recycling and reducing wastage in an accessible way.
Yeah.
But why don't you think it matters too much if we're concentrating on things like cutting down on our plastic straw use, for example?
Look, I think War on Waste was a positive contribution to the discussion in putting the spotlight on the issues of climate change and of waste in particular. But I do think that we've seen in Australia not just the current generation of student going through school, but a whole generation before that who have been given the reduce, reuse, recycle message, have taken that to heart. And yet those individual actions alone, in my view, are not sufficient by any means, are very short of being sufficient to address the magnitude of the problem. And I think that's borne out by the fact that in Australia we've seen steadily rising carbon emissions, and we're also seeing steadily rising waste, in particular e-waste, which is headed for landfill. And these problems can't just be solved by the choices of individuals or individual household consumption. They require society-wide measures to reorganise how goods and services are produced in our society and how waste is disposed of.
So why have we seen that increase in waste if individuals are focused on reducing or increasing their recycling or reducing their own wastage?
Well, I think all the focus on individual action focuses on household recycling, and there is a strong track record in Australia of households using their recycling bins.
Yeah.
But there's not such a strong track record by business, which produces roughly half the waste in the country. Household waste is some 40% of waste produced. That's just at the waste end, but it is also undeniably the case that household consumption hasn't gone down, even if households are recycling more.
Yeah.
And that's got to do with the fact that households really don't make the decisions in our society about how goods and services are produced, marketed and sold. So we see this quite ridiculous situation where supermarkets seem to sell an ever-increasing volume of foodstuffs wrapped in plastics, and we just don't have we as individuals, we may have a political democracy, but we don't have an economic democracy. We don't get to say directly to the producers of those goods that enough's enough. We will no longer put up with you wrapping things in plastic that could be produced in a much more environmentally friendly kind of way.
Yeah. So in the same piece, there was a thread where you spoke about, well, you're critical, I guess, of market solutions to reducing emissions, such as emissions trading schemes or carbon taxes. So in my own mind, I did have, reflecting on Australia's time with the carbon tax, I did have quite a positive view of the carbon tax and its effect on emissions. So I went back and had a look.
Yeah.
And it does seem there is some doubt about how much the carbon tax did reduce Australia's emissions. There are some suggestions that the companies that were covered by the emissions scheme, their emissions fell by about 7%.
Yeah.
But there were outside factors that might have influenced that, such as the shutting down of some large electricity generators and the closure of some major manufacturing operations. So what is essentially your critique of market solutions to reducing emissions?
Well, I don't think that they're a solution. I think that perhaps some of the best research that's been done on this has been done by Naomi Klein. Her book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism and the Climate Crisis, examines the experience of the European emissions trading scheme, which is a project that's gone a lot further than the short-lived carbon tax in Australia.
Yeah.
And basically the emissions trading scheme essentially allows polluters to produce pollution permits. So the idea is that by having to pay for permits to pollute, polluters will presumably produce less. But what this produces is a market in pollution permits. And the way in which these permits are created, apart from being created by governments directly, is that companies that engage in preserving forests, for example, as carbon sinks, can then sell on credits to polluters. So you have really a merry-go-round where no doubt market mechanisms do inhibit carbon emissions in one place, but this trading cycle basically then incentivises more carbon emissions essentially in another place. And in the experience in Australia, the emissions trading scheme was introduced by the Rudd government at a time where the Australian economy was hitting a downturn. The impact of the global financial crisis wasn't immediately felt in 2008, 2009 in Australia. It was starting to be felt at the time that this emissions trading scheme was implemented. So I think a 7% reduction in emissions is quite feasibly the result of a slowing economy. We do also know that this emissions trading scheme, or was this carbon tax, I should say rather, polluters were given compensation for reducing their emissions, so essentially handouts to polluters, and at the same time certain sections of industry were exempt from the carbon tax. So that in itself should, I think, raise alarm bells with the Australian public. And I think the tax itself also provided a green light for energy producers to up the costs of electricity, retail electricity production, not so much for big business, but for households. And not surprisingly, that turned the public against the carbon tax. So first, it wasn't in place long enough for us to feasibly measure what impact it did have, but it was actually quite popular with much of business that benefited both from rising prices of their goods and of their services and government compensation. And in fact, the oil and gas industry continued to function and to invest in exploration, particularly gas exploration, with the assumption that gas exploration would essentially emit a little less carbon than traditional dirty coal production.
So the focus on individual actions and also Australia's dabbling in market solutions to reducing emissions do seem to be ways in which we can continue with the status quo of how we live now and how business is done, with just some slight tinkering in the hope that we can bring down emissions enough to combat the worst effects of climate change. So just going back to the recent protests, what can these students, or even examples from the past, teach us about challenging the status quo?
Well, this student strike is not unprecedented in Australia. If we go back to, for example, French nuclear testing in the Pacific in the mid-1990s, tens of thousands of high school students took strike action on that occasion, was part of an international campaign that basically forced the Chirac government in France to abandon its South Pacific nuclear testing program. A few years before that, in 1989, we saw the spread of the Environment Youth Alliance in Australia, and high school students starting to get organised. And in fact, we can go right back to the 1970s and look at the example of the first Earth Day in 1970 that spurred students and young people into action. So it's not unprecedented, but if we are to look honestly at those previous initiatives, we've seen them run out of steam. And I think in part because mainstream environmental organisations have focused precisely on both individual solutions and market solutions. And we really need to get the message out that what we need to address this issue is a global mass movement students' action should serve as an example to other sections of society, that we need to come out en masse, not just rely on lobbying our parliamentarians, but to take collective action that can challenge the whole business as usual, the whole nature of capitalism and the growth-first economic model that we live under.
Mm-hmm. So what other groups do you see that could kind of build on this energy and could join in a movement that these students are leading at the moment? For instance, other groups potentially aren't focused first and foremost on environmental movements.
So going back to the 1970s, if you like, the first wave of the modern environment movement, in the United States, unions became very engaged with environmental issues, in particular workplace safety issues.
Okay.
So nuclear power plants in the oil industry, there was action by trade unions who sought the support of environment organisations and acted together to address those issues. In the 1970s in Australia, the Builders Labourers Federation worked side by side conservationists to prevent the bulldozing of the rocks in Sydney and other heritage sites in and around Sydney. So again, these actions are not unprecedented, but we have a long way to go, I think, at the moment in Australia to forge an effective partnership between trade unions and the labour movement more widely and environmentalists and students to bring into being really the sort of movement we need.
Okay, well, thanks very much for your time today, Nick. I think it's great that we at least have people speaking about the possibility of bringing these partnerships together and starting that sort of movement. So thank you very much for answering my questions.
You're welcome, Jan.
Thank you. Nick Everett on the potential for building Australia's student strike into a wider movement for climate action, and why that movement must look at asking questions of our consumption-driven world model. At the very top of the episode, you heard the opening strains of Looking Out for Country by Githable Next Generation, a song produced by Desert P Media. The same track will play us out. Thanks very much for your attention.
When I'm looking out for country, country looks out for me. When I'm looking out for country, country looks out for me. When I'm looking out for country.